Act 2. Farms versus Dialogue. With the demise of earlier apologetic efforts at the New World Archaeology Institute, the approach that Hugh Nibley had laid out inspired a whole new generation of apologists interested in establishing the Book of Mormon in the Old World. I'll just point out the Eurocentrism and colonial frameworks of the New World versus Old World labels, but I'm reproducing them here because those were the ones that they were using. Jack Welch, among others, was part of this movement and founded Farms in 1979 to become a hub for this kind of scholarship. Farms grew in the early 1980s at BYU when Welch moved there in 1980 and established it as a place to defend the Book of Mormon. He also had published his edited volume on chiasmus, an ancient literary form, in 1981. Some of the early dialogue contributors, like John L. Sorensen, flocked to Farms. They soon tried to position themselves as the Center for Book of Mormon research. One of their targets was a man named George Smith, who was a freelance historian and financial wizard working in San Francisco. He's the founder of Signature Books. In 1983, George Smith published an article, Isaiah Updated. He discusses a problem that had been earlier mentioned by B.H. Roberts and Sidney Sperry, among others. The problem in brief was this. Scholars no longer accepted the unity of the book of Isaiah, nor attributed it all to the historical Isaiah. The problem was that the later chapters seemed to come from a later prophet, nicknamed Second Isaiah, who wrote during the Babylonian exile, namely after Lehi had reportedly left Jerusalem. The problem is that this text, which didn't exist until after Lehi was on a boat sailing to the New World, somehow ends up in Nephi's record. This paper goes into a lot more issues about Christian and LDS interpretation of Isaiah more generally, challenging the validity of these supposed prophecies. Defenders of the Book of Mormon argued that the evidence should be read the other way around, that the Book of Mormon provided clear evidence that Second Isaiah was pre-exilic, and that Isaiah is a unified text. Smith's article called into question these claims. This article got a lot of attention in letters, including from apologist Bill Hamblin. In 1984, George Smith had another important article. Quote, "Is there any way to escape these difficulties? The Book of Mormon Studies of B.H. Roberts." As mentioned before, Roberts was a member of the Quorum of the 70 and a leading intellectual in the church. Beginning in the 1920s, he began to seriously examine the arguments around the Book of Mormon historicity, but became skeptical of many of those same arguments. For a while, before George Smith's article, the debate was whether Roberts was expressing his own doubts or merely laying out the best versions of the counter-arguments to the Book of Mormon. Roberts seemed to have been persuaded that there were significant, meaningful parallels between the Book of Mormon and Ethan Smith's A View of the Hebrews, a 19th century fictional account that predates the Book of Mormon, but also tells a story of Israelite lineage of Native Americans. Roberts also covers the archaeological difficulties, and Smith discusses these as well. A lot has changed since the 1920s, but not that much, and the core issues that Roberts faced remained important through the 1980s. This article, too, attracted negative attention from Farms, since Jack Welch had advised Dialogue against publishing it. His connections to Elder Neil A. Maxwell may explain why this otherwise benign piece ended up in a memo by Elder Maxwell advising that John Sorensen be commissioned to, quote, respond to the recent ramblings of George Smith. He issued a memo in the fall of 1984, then commissioning, quote, a scholarly defense of the historicity of the Book of Mormon. The Ensign published Sorensen's essays Digging into the Book of Mormon, Parts 1 and 2, a few months later, and many saw that as a rebuke of George Smith specifically. That same year, Sorensen published his classic book, An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon. In the summer of 1985 issue, George Smith writes a letter to the editor at Dialogue. responding to John Sorensen, challenging some of the revisionist apologetics, limited geography, and the idea that there were other people already in the land beside the Book of Mormon people. Robert Smith, another apologist in this time period, responds with a caustic letter back. This went back and forth in the letters to the editor section for a while. Spring and summer 1986 have pro-Sorensen letters on geography and animals, for instance. George Smith's pretty mild criticisms of Book of Mormon historicity became a particular target for farms over these early years, and they increasingly went after him personally. Bill Hamblin, Daniel Peterson, Lewis Midgley, Robert Smith, and others were involved. As I mentioned, George Smith was the founder of Signature Books, and the conflicts between these two presses, Farms and Signature, dominated more than a decade of Mormon intellectual energy. In the fall of 1984, Grant Underwood wrote a really important article, Book of Mormon Usage in Early LDS Theology. Now, this research has since been updated and nuanced, but Underwood made a fascinating observation about early LDS citations of the Book of Mormon. They are actually very rare in the LDS periodicals up through 1846, even to the point of what he called neglect of the Book of Mormon. Underwood's argument was an interesting intervention in two ways. First, a number of LDS scholars were looking to the Book of Mormon to understand early LDS doctrinal development. It's notable that the theology of the Book of Mormon departs from mainstream LDS teachings on a number of points, and people began to argue that it represented an earlier Joseph Smith, for instance. Underwood's argument challenged this by suggesting that the Book of Mormon had minimal use or impact on early LDS thought in general, let alone doctrinal development. Second, this absence of the Book of Mormon was implicitly contrasted with the modern church, where the Book of Mormon was quickly outpacing the Bible in importance after Ezra Taft Benson had really centered it. Whether good or ill, the Book of Mormon was treated rather casually in Smith's day, including by Smith himself. What was important when it was cited was the millenarian ideas in the Book of Mormon. This is what we call reception history, which looks at how a text has been received. Different from George Smith's study of B.H. Roberts, Underwood was expanding this kind of research to statistical analysis of the use of the Book of Mormon by Latter-day Saints. So the early 1980s was still a time when diverse voices and approaches appeared in dialogue, especially the letters to the editor back and forth. But hostility was also increasing from a vocal and forceful faction who believed they had apostolic sanction for their tactics. It's the early phases of what is going to become known as the Book of Mormon Wars.
Mom had the loudest voice and strongest opinions in the household.
It's impossible to feel the spirit in these episodes.
From there, it was the grim weeper. How could you have done this to me, to us?
That may sound blasphemous, but it's true.
She was determined and committed to her sometimes eccentric opinions.
Meanwhile, I'm wondering who's this wonderful fairy tale us he's talking about.
Most of my mixed state experiences are channeled into a prayer to my Heavenly Father to please send help. Please take me out of this. Please show me a sign that you still love me.
No, of course not. That's why I'm here. I'm willing to do whatever to make things right.
This is Dialogue Out Loud, a curated selection of fiction and essays from the pages of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, brought to life through voice and music.
I feel entirely alone in a permanent night, blocked from sunlight by the wall of earth that is my chemical imbalance.
My parents were persuaded that this was not just an adolescent whim and allowed me to be baptized 3 days shy of my 19th birthday.
Oh, he'll hold my hand in sacrament meeting and take me by the arm and open the car door and do all that chivalrous Sir Walter Raleigh stuff in public. But safe at home, I'm invisible.
This year, we're bringing you even more great audio stories from our quarterly journal, including pieces by Neil David Sylvester, Linda Hoffman Kimball, Monica Crowfoot, and more. Subscribe to the Dialogue podcast to keep up on our latest episodes or go to dialoguejournal.com for for this and more great audio content. That's dialoguejournal.com.